So I'm pleased to be able to talk to you today with my book actually coming out this coming spring. I'm showing you the cover here. It's due out in March. And just to give you an overall sense of my research, I describe this as a history of Cleveland's black middle class neighborhoods, this kind of outward movement in search of livable space. Whereas, as we know, many African Americans were constrained to living in the inner city, places more toward the periphery, initially Glenville, Mount Pleasant, and eventually LeeHarvard became important places to exercise upward mobility and to live out the American dream after World War II. So my work is joining work on race and inequality in 20th century U.S. cities, but I'm especially interested to see how African Americans were able to successfully get across and navigate these discriminatory barriers in order to live successful lives. A lot of the existing research kind of emphasizes the structural forces that fostered unequal access, but sometimes African Americans come across as victims of forces beyond their control. So while acknowledging the important struggles and challenges that African Americans face to make their lives and living at the urban periphery, I nonetheless am interested to see how did they strive. They proved to be patient, persistent, pragmatic, and frequently successful in improving their living conditions at the outer city. So I'm using this phrase surrogate suburbs to kind of point to the fact that African Americans had difficulty or were prevented from living in suburbs in many cases until the later portion of the 20th century. But these outlying areas of the city, the outer city, became important as kind of surrogate suburbs into this recent past. This is just a kind of indication of my use of geographic information systems to kind of plot exactly where were people living. And I'm particularly interested in these clusters, Mount Pleasant, Lisaville, which I'll talk about today. Even on the west side, there was a single historic African American community known as West Park, right on the border of Lyndale. So these, again, were places where African Americans were able to break out of the large, overcrowded Cedar Central area and start to exercise this kind of upwardly mobile American dream. Okay, so just before we get to the specifics on LeeHarvard, just to give you some sense of how this process played out, I'm showing you here a map of census tracts in Cleveland with the census year in which they became majority African American. So you can see this kind of outward movement, especially to southeast Cleveland, that west side tract I mentioned only becoming majority black in 1980. But if we focus on the east side, you can see a clear movement decade by decade out to the southeast as well as to the northeast part of the city. Okay, so I want to talk about LeeHarvard specifically today because it is such an important place where African Americans exercise this upward mobility and suburban style living. So some of the themes I want to cover in this first period include how did the land first start getting broken up and developed into subdivisions? What were the different kind of visions or variations on suburban living? What happened during the Great Depression? Because we had a kind of stalling in the development of housing and also the involvement of the federal government, if you're familiar with redlining, that was actually invented by the federal government, and that became a factor which we'll look at in a minute here. The pre-existing African-American enclave off Seville Road, the controversy over building public housing during the World War II period, and then the start of this kind of boom in developing the area immediately following World War II. So the area that became LeeHarvard was originally part of Warrenville Township, which was actually one of the original townships of the Western Reserve, formed in 1814. And so you can see here, Warrenville Township, the southwestern corner became LeeHarvard, but this also was broken up and became suburbs such as Beechwood, Shaker Heights, and Warrensville Heights. So far as I know, it has ceased to exist. There was a little portion of Warrensville Township existing until Highland Hills was created in the 1990s. This also included the short-lived Miles Heights, which I'll talk about in a minute, which existed from 1927 to 1932. So basically, this was farmland into the 1920s. Wow, really sensitive controls here. This is a close-up. I know you can't do much with the writing there, but if you could see in this corner that became LeeHarvard, there's a couple names that stand out. If you're familiar with Judson Drive, there's a landowner named Judson in that same very area. So there is some kind of continuity with later development. But essentially, these are farms. And starting around 1921, the northern part north of Harvard, began to be developed. There was a company called the Rapid Transit Land Sales Company that may have already been anticipating the development of the Shaker Heights Rapid Transit Line by the Van Swerningen brothers. And other portions of the area started to develop shortly after World War I. So we're talking really the very late teens into the mid-1920s when this first becomes developed. And you can see I'm showing you here a page from a Sanborn Fire Insurance Atlas. These are great historical sources, but one very telling thing you may notice, well, first of all, there aren't that many streets compared to what we have today, but really they're only seeing fit to give you details on this area, this pink area where you'll see a kind of zoomed-in street view, which I'll show you in a minute. All these other streets were not covered under the Fire Insurance Atlas, implying there were not very many houses built. So they may have laid the streets by 1926 when this map was made, but there weren't very many houses there yet. Up to a third of the families living in the area were Southern and Eastern Europeans, especially Hungarians and Czechs, moving out of areas closer into the city. And again, there were African Americans living here from the 1920s on, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute here. So you can get some sense, again, not that many houses, but there were houses already by 1934. You can get a sense there. Here, just north of Miles Avenue, more houses, but again, you're seeing substantial vacant land. And again, this would characterize the area into the 1950s. Another one here showing you near present-day Lotus Drive. Lots of vacant tracts and even signs, you can't read it very well here, but signs advertising land for sale. So in other words, during the 1920s, there's a land boom, and they're trying to sell this land and develop it for housing. However, the Great Depression, which hit in 1929, cut short land sales and subdivision ventures in the area, leaving many tax delinquent properties that went up for sale, sheriff's sales. And real estate agents talking about this said that this, especially southern portion of the area, was developed prematurely. So let me show you one of these redlining maps that was developed by the federal government in the 1930s. These were kind of sort of top secret. They were developed in consultation with banks, and banks used these to basically direct investment funds. It created kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of areas being rated risky investments that pretty much ensured that down the line they didn't get the same kind of mortgage financing as other areas. So interestingly enough, what we can see for LeeHarvard is you've got all four of these grades that they designated, and these had letter grades as well as colors associated with them. So in the area that became LeeHarvard right here, you can see a green area. Green was considered the best, an A-rated area. There's a substantial portion that's blue that was a B-rated area north of Harvard. Much of the area, the southern portion, is yellow, which was described as definitely declining. And then also this pocket here of red is the African American settlement at Seville Road that I mentioned. And red was designated hazardous. And that's where this term redlining comes from, literally drawing red lines around certain areas and recommending not for mortgage funds to be made available in that area. So let me just give you a little bit of the verbiage that was associated with these different areas, and you get some sense of the kind of racialized and racist language that was used at this time, directed not even just at African Americans, but even at Southern and Eastern Europeans who were considered kind of risky in terms of resident at the time. So this green area here bordering Shaker Heights was 85% native-born population. It was said to be a good investment because of the rigid deed and zoning restrictions. Basically what that meant is that there were clauses written right into the deed saying that these houses could not be sold to African Americans or Jews, actually, at that time. The blue rated areas here were said to be, quote, in a bracket above the means of the average undesirable foreign. Although there were already 30% Southern Eastern Europeans, well, actually, German and Czech were the predominant ethnic groups in that time. But these real estate officials were still confident that with 97% single-family occupancy, 85% owner occupancy, and deed restrictions that were in force until 1950, this would still remain a quote-unquote secure investment area for the next several years. The southern portion that was yellow, again, was rated as, quote, definitely declining due to the larger presence of Southern and Eastern Europeans, a large proportion of two-family housing, poor fire protection, and long distance to shopping facilities. As of 1939, only 20% of the lots in the southern portion were developed, but even in this northern portion, only about 30% developed as of 1939. Some of the terms that were used for this area here, better type Hungarian and Czech, mostly factory workers, mechanics, craftsmen with some office workers. But this lower or southernmost portion here, it was described as not favorable, suffering from a lack of uniformity in construction due to the lack of gas lines and sewers, a scattering of colored families in the western part, moderately heavy foreign occupancy, and American inhabitants of very low income type, heavily on relief rolls. So again, you can get the sense of how these real estate assessors evaluated and thought in terms of race and assumed that because these were inhabited by working class, immigrant, or African American residents, that they would inevitably decline. Again, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy when banks hesitate to lend money in those areas. They even expressed concern at the interracial student body at Beehive Elementary School. And this is notable because it was probably the most integrated racially integrated elementary school in Cleveland at the time. You can see in this 1936 picture a fairly balanced. It looks to be about a quarter African American students. But this was, again, considered a kind of negative mark against the area by these real estate assessors who made these redlining maps. Okay, so to kind of step back and tell you what I'm driving at here, you're basically seeing a clash of two different visions for suburban development. One of them was an earlier pattern of working class and African American suburbanization, an attempt to escape the crowded, smoky city and achieve some security through homeownership. Many people built the homes themselves. There's a possibility to raise your own food, raise chickens, grow some crops, engage in productive economic enterprises. You could have a shop. You could store gravel on your lot and build driveways. So people using their property for more productive purposes. That's coming up against a newly developing kind of middle-class endeavor of real estate as an investment, of property as something that's supposed to appreciate over time and that needs to be protected against supposed negative influences. So you've got those two competing visions in this area playing out. By 1936, there were said to be increasing construction in the northern part of the area as the housing market picked back up. So you can see some houses, brick houses, by that time. This is interesting. I uncovered a newly built colonial in 1941. Even during World War II, there were some houses being built. And how do I know this is a newly built house? Well, it looks pretty new, doesn't it? But I also found the Sanborn Fire Insurance map page, and this is a close-up of the source that I showed you earlier. This house is on Glendale Avenue, and it's actually that one lot there that is undeveloped is the address that's associated with this house that I'm showing you here. So in other words, This is from August of 1941, and the map from that same, earlier that year, didn't even have this house yet. So basically, this is still an area under development. You can see Glendale is pretty much built out, but you can get a sense of only about 30% developed at this time. Another very interesting feature that I would point out on this map would be along Lee Road here, virtually none of the commercial properties are yet developed. These would all become storefronts in later years. You do see here and here some business enterprises, and this one down here actually was the Shaker Grove Dairy. So I've got a picture of the Shaker Grove Dairy in 1941. This building still exists to this day, by the way. But even this didn't exist just 5 years earlier. That's the same address being a vacant lot. So again, giving you a sense of this as a largely undeveloped area, still being created into suburban tract housing, suburban-style tract housing from farmland. And at this time, the kinds of businesses that are likely to be operating here are ones that require a lot of space. So this dairy had a lot of delivery trucks behind the back. I'm going to show you a picture of a car dealership a little down the line. So at this time, when property was still relatively cheap to acquire, the kinds of businesses moving into the area were ones that required a lot of space. As the area develops and gets more storefronts, these are going to be increasingly the exception. But I just wanted to give you a sense of really what the community is looking like at that time. Now, I mentioned to you there was a pre-existing African-American housing development in the vicinity of Lee and Seville roads that dated to 1920. And I started with a close-up of that same Sanborn map page. And what you can see, if you can make it out here, is whoever was using this map for fire insurance purposes has circled the area and written Little Africa. Okay, so there are a lot of nicknames associated with this area. This is probably a white real estate developer using that name. I'm not imagining that African Americans would have applied that name themselves. But again, to remind you, there's a very racialized and racist kind of understanding of housing development at this time. This was the origins of this were in the Bella Villa allotment. The city's leading African-American businessman of the 1920s, Herbert S. Chauncey, bought land in this area during the booming housing market, or the booming land market of the era. He actually also had an insurance company as well as a People's Realty company, and he specifically was seeking to enable African Americans to move further out to the outskirts of the city. Unfortunately, the Great Depression hit in 1929, and he died in 1930, so it didn't get a chance to fully develop. But people continued to buy lots, build houses, and move into this area. So again, the key idea here was to achieve some self-sufficiency that was not available if you were living in Cedar Central in the crowded inner city. And Cedar Central was home to 90% of African Americans in 1930. So these areas were an exception at the time, but they would become more and more common because after World War II, people started moving further and further out to Glenville, to Mount Pleasant, and eventually to LeeHarvard. So you can get some sense of the semi-rural lifestyle here with people, again, oftentimes building their own housing. You can maybe even see some construction supplies piled up here, growing some of their own food. And so this is actually also kind of a recreation of the southern lifestyle that many people had recently left. Some people had recently migrated from the south and set up communities that basically recaptured some of the self-sufficiency of southern living with some of the advantages of the northern city. They were still within commuting distance to have jobs in the city. And there were skilled workers living in the community, so it's been described as kind of a proto-middle class community, so laying some kind of groundwork for upward mobility. It was initially contained within the short-lived suburb of Miles Heights. Again, that was an independent municipality existing from 1927 to 1932. And notably, it elected the state's first black mayor. That was Arthur R. Johnston, a Jamaican immigrant and a county road foreman who was elected in 1929 with the support of half of the residents. And African Americans made up about a third of Miles Heights' population at the time. So that implies he was also tapping partially into white support. There were a lot of Italian Americans living in the area, and they also supported Mr. Johnston. Cleveland kind of forcibly annexed Miles Heights from 1930 to 1932. That's a very interesting story that I can't get into just now. But Johnson himself condemned his opponents as Klansmen, so he clearly saw this as a hostile takeover. Living conditions remained rough in the area. One reason why African Americans were able to purchase this land, one, they were getting there before developers had a chance to buy it up and put in place some of those deed restrictions I mentioned earlier. Also, this was a low-lying area, so that drainage was always a problem. In fact, until very recently, flooding has been an issue in this area. So, in other words, this was land that was initially bypassed over by housing developers, and that was how African Americans were able to get out there and get a foothold in the area. And there continued to be no sidewalks, no sewers into the early post-war period. Some houses lacked electrical connections, although you can see an electrical pole here. So some people did. So it was kind of on the basis of whether you could, whether you saw fit to tap into that. Most people relied on outhouses. So again, you can see this as a self-sufficient community. 76% of the people own their own homes. In 1945, only 18% of the properties needed repairs. However, the surrounding white residents considered this as a quote-unquote Negro slum. That was the term used by the real estate industry. And a 1945 Cleveland Press article called this Cleveland's Tobacco Road. So clearly, there's a difference of perspective here on what's going on. And there's, even though this is a kind of isolated, insulated community at the time, we're kind of setting up the possibility of a kind of racial antagonism that we're going to see playing out in the later 1940s and 50s. We did see the Miles Heights Progressive League lobbying for city improvements. So African Americans wanted to upgrade the area and install sewers. You can see here people's mailboxes were all, there wasn't door-to-door mail delivery initially. That didn't happen until 1948. So the mail truck would come and deliver to all the boxes here at the kind of entrance to the development. In 1948, they got door-to-door mail service. Sewers began to be installed in that year. But full water and sewer service was not completed until 1954. And bus service was actually denied to the area until 1955, supposedly as a result of a quote-unquote gentleman's agreement between the city of Cleveland and Shaker Heights. One kind of initial controversy that I'll mention during World War II already was over a temporary war housing project, the Lisaville Homes. This was built to house African American foundry workers who migrated to Cleveland during the war, and there's a severe housing shortage in general in Cleveland during World War II, and especially for African Americans. And so the Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority built this temporary war housing project. It was initially opposed by white residents in LeeHarvard and the surrounding suburbs of Maple Heights and Garfield Heights, with the mayor of Maple Heights saying this was, quote, bringing the slums close to Maple Heights. They filed a taxpayers' lawsuit which delayed the project for about 6 months, but ultimately because of the wartime emergency and because it was being built right next to an already existing African American community, it went through. And this housing project remained into the post-war until 1957, 58. It was demolished. Again, that was because there was such a severe housing shortage specifically for African Americans. It did deteriorate eventually because it was, again, built as a temporary development, not built to outlast the war. But this gives some sense of the kind of coming conflicts over land use in the area that I'll get into in our next section. So just give you a sense of the state of development at the end of World War II, showing you here a shot of Lee Road where you can start to see houses, but still a lot of that vacant land remaining. These, by the way, are pictures from the collection at Cleveland Public Library of building and zoning violations. So that's important to keep in mind when you're seeing this. You see the little X's; those are the identified building violations, but they really kind of capture a day-to-day sense of what's going on in the community. You can literally see this community being built, as on Judson Drive you've got a steam shovel excavating there. You can see some brand new housing there on Cloverside Avenue in 1949. Cement mixer on Walden Avenue. So to give you the sense that all over this area there's new housing going up in the immediate post-war period. Just to give you a sense here, this is the vacant land that I've referred to with here a sign that says for sale, 25.5 acres. That same corner, just 8 years later, has a good number of homes. And most strikingly, the LeeHarvard Shopping Center opened in late 1949 on former farmland. I'm showing you right here in 1948, right before the building of the development. Just got some billboards there. Incidentally, the owner of LeeHarvard Shopping Center hunted quail on this site during World War II. So that gives you some sense of really just how rural it was. In 1954, it's a full-on shopping center, and it was such a resounding success with its modern parking. In other words, you didn't have to park on the street, that the plaza size and the parking was doubled in 1955. Okay, so moving into the second phase of development of the area. What we're seeing in this period is continuing booming residential and commercial development, which continued in the early 1960s, and expansion of housing options for African Americans, both in and around the Lisaville enclave and across Lee Road to the east in the vicinity of Carouge Park. We saw the first African American family moving to LeeHarvard proper in 1953, which created kind of a controversy with the white residents there and was mediated by the mayor himself. And by 1961, blockbusting real estate tactics, kind of aggressive sales tactics, was very rapidly transformed this from an all-white neighborhood to a black middle-class stronghold. So white flight commencing in 1961 and largely complete by 1965. Okay, so just kind of talk us through this next phase of development. I've got an aerial photo here, and if you look at some of these areas that are vacant land in 1951, these may be streets that you're familiar with. I'm just going to flip forward 8 years, and you can see those kind of fill in with housing, industrial development, just to kind of go back again. So you've got all kinds of things, whole streets being put in place over this relatively rapid interval. And in fact, 2/3 of LeeHarvard's housing was built after 1950. Again, that's important to keep in mind because we think of post-World War II as being the booming of the suburbs. There were still areas in the cities proper that had vacant land for development, and those were developing along similar lines to what we saw in suburbs at this time. We continued to see commercial development booming. Again, business enterprises requiring large amounts of land, like the car dealership I mentioned earlier. Here you can see Englander used cars. But again, you can still see substantial vacant land. Here we've got a sporting goods store with a lot of vacant lots there. And this was basically at the city limits, but still. In this, you can see a bank close to the intersection of LeeHarvard, but still lots of vacant land here to the north. Some people had home-based businesses. This is an accountant. You can see the sign Income Tax Service. And so this building is actually still existing as well as a lot of the buildings I'm showing you today are. So this is a kind of mixed residential and commercial development along the main business strips. Can still see a lot of white ethnic owned or Southern and Eastern European owned businesses like the Hrichko funeral home here. This building no longer exists. But into the 1950s, you can still get a sense of the historic origins of the community as it's about to shift into a middle-class African-American community. A lot of the overall trend was toward low-rise shopping centers with car-oriented, drive-up kinds of businesses, while still remaining pedestrian accessible. You can see people able to walk along the main thoroughfares here. Drive-ins like a burger joint here from 1963. This buildup of the commercial lots along Lee Road would continue into the early 1960s here. In 1957, you can see there's still a vacant lot here. This same address, just 6 years later, they've knocked down the Quaker Maid, but this building is still in place, and they're redeveloping that lot there. So again, into the early 1960s, you still have economic development going on in this area. African Americans were also interested to build new housing after World War II. There was still ample vacant land in the vicinity of Lisaville and across Lee Road to the east, again, near Carouche Park. And during the war, this Census Tracks African American population had jumped by nearly five-fold increase. It had doubled, not counting Seville homes. So what we know based on people's oral histories as well as this statistical data is that some people were moving out of the Seville homes and buying or building houses in the near vicinity after the war. And we actually had some African American owned construction companies and contractors advertising and building. Here is an ad for houses around the Lisaville development here. You can see 16202 Seville Road, and it's specifically targeting World War II veterans. If you were a veteran, and especially if you were building in an already established African American area, you were eligible for preferential loans under the GI Bill. We know that African Americans weren't able to take full advantage of these because they were basically denied the right to buy houses in many areas. But in this area, they were able to do that. And so you can see specifically FHA, VA approved. You can see they're offering non-vets special terms as well. So using some of the buildup of wartime earnings as well as some of the benefits some people were able to take advantage of after World War II, people are expanding the housing choices in this vicinity after the war. Now, I'm really pleased to be able to show you some change over time. Again, I think this is why these pictures are so fascinating. And what I want to show you here, we can literally see a structure going up over time if we look here. So we're right in the Lisaville Historic African American Enclave. And if you look right here, there's a vacant lot. The building inspector has already marked this for a violation, probably because there may be construction supplies starting to build up there. But so just keep your eye on this vacant lot to the left of this delicatessen Ellie's Place here. Okay, so in 1947, still pretty much a vacant lot. You can sort of make out there's something going on over here to the left of the lot, some building going on here. By 1950, there's a small store that's been completed. And you can see school children walking past the store there. So that by 1952, it's part of the kind of mini business strip that you have in the enclave there. So that's an example of a commercial property that's being built, but there are also people building houses. And again, this is continuing on a tradition of self-building. This looks to be someone connecting up to the sewer system and also has their house still under construction here in 1957. Here's another example of someone building, and one way to economize was to use recycled lumber. So this resident has a kind of stockpile of used lumber that they're recycling and using to help build. That was a more affordable way to add on to your house. So again, this is a kind of time-honored tradition. It's not specific to African American residents. Some white residents also engage in this kind of self-building. This is an area that would become developed for new houses for the black middle class, so that I'm going to tell you about in a minute. But at this moment, you can see this white couple building their own house. So again, this is this earlier working class suburbanization with a very different kind of implication and different ideas surrounding what's the proper use of property and what's the correct way to go about developing housing. Again, these are people who save up, they economize, they build housing as they can afford, as compared to a developer that goes and builds a whole subdivision at one time. And that would require a lot more capital and being able to mobilize all the labor and materials to be able to do that. This is a more individualized family approach, which had been the earlier mode of suburbanization in the area. So this kind of conflicting idea over land use set up some significant conflicts in the early post-war period. I'll just give you some basics here. These are two maps from my book. What you can take away is you can see an increase in African American population. This is the Lisaville Homes project. This is the historic enclave. You can see the Lisaville Homes disappear there, but what you're seeing is people buying across the street. And I'm going to be mentioning a white developer, George Goodman, who built some 600 homes for African American occupancy in the early 60s. You can also see here this 1953 clash over Wendell and Genevieve Stewart buying as the first African American couple in LeeHarvard in 1953. By 1960, there's a substantial sprinkling of African American families in the northwest quadrant of the neighborhood, still almost entirely white on the other side of the street, however. And what I'm going to be talking about here are these dotted lines, these kind of proposed industrial and other housing kind of developments which generated controversies and led white and black residents to clash amongst themselves and in some cases to join up to oppose the different development plans for the area. So in 1951, Councilman Ernest Atkinson, with the backing of the ward's white residents, proposed a zoning change to industrial for a parcel at Lee and Seville Roads. Okay, this was in order for the electric controller company to build a factory in the area. And there were many firms that were interested to build factories on the outskirts of the city. There was plenty of vacant land, especially on the west side. But the kind of insidious hidden agenda here was to basically wall off the existing African American enclave at Lee and Seville Roads. And it had an even more insidious implication because industrial zoning was considered, again, by this logic of the real estate industry at the time, to be a negative influence. By building this factory, the Federal Housing Administration would no longer insure mortgages in the area. So basically, this was a way to prevent the continuing movement of African American families into the area and the continuing construction of homes that I was describing earlier. So this rezoning did actually pass despite a citywide campaign organized by the NAACP that collected 10,000 signatures opposing the measure. And black churches in Glenville were especially active in leading that effort. But what they got was the beginnings of this industrial property that you can still see along the railroad tracks south of Miles Avenue and in this corridor. In 1952, there was a plan to build public housing on a vacant parcel off of McCracken Road that also drew fierce opposition. At the time, that was mostly from white LeeHarvard homeowners, as well as ones in Garfield Heights, Maple Heights. But interestingly enough, in this case, a handful of African American residents were brought on board, also opposing public housing for the area. You may know about the 1968 to 69 controversy with Mayor Carl Stokes. This is an earlier controversy from 1952, and I'm showing you Henry Hawk, who was a black homeowner in front of his brand new brick bungalow he and his wife built with their own hands on a vacant lot off Seville Road. So there was a handful of African American opponents who joined together with white homeowners to oppose public housing. For the most part, Cleveland's African American community favored this project, and they kind of castigated and chided Henry Hawk, and actually Arthur Bussey, the developer, also opposed public housing for the area. Resident Queenie Wade of Myrtle Avenue, she and her husband had invested some $30,000 in their property, even installing the sewer lines themselves. So basically what I'm saying, there was a handful of African American homeowners who opposed this 1952 public housing proposal. So that's one case in which they actually come together with the white LeeHarvard homeowners. resulting in the withdrawal of that plan early 1953. In 1952, there was yet another proposal for the area to build low-rise garden-type apartments by the developer George Goudreau. And Goudreau, I uncovered his correspondence behind the scenes with city planning officials. He was actually attempting to get that Lisaville African-American enclave completely wiped off the map, which actually happened in other cities. Thankfully, in this case, it did not take place. But there were places, this is actually known as expulsive zoning. In Atlanta, for example, where I'm currently living, there is as many as 13 pockets of African-American settlement north of the city that were wiped out as a result of zoning changes after World War II, and this was almost one of them. There was, in 1961, another zoning change for an industrial park that was opposed by the Lisaville Citizens Council. Although by this point, the issue had shifted somewhat. You can get some sense of that from the sign here, rezoning brings slums. Okay. The Lisaville Citizens Council President Clarence Thompson stated, "We're trying to build up a nice neighborhood, but instead we're being surrounded by factories." And another resident said, "The rezoning will let in other undesirable uses. In 20 years, this area may look like another Woodland Avenue." So in other words, although they're still interested in preserving vacant land, this is shifting more toward maintaining an acceptable quality of life. And so that raises the question, what had changed since 1951? Well, the main thing that had changed was during the 1950s, African-American housing options in Cleveland and around the country were starting to open up slightly. Nearly 700,000 new housing units were moved into by African-American families during the 1950s nationwide, despite the discrimination that shut them largely out of the suburbs. This explains my book title where I talk about surrogate suburbs as being places where African-Americans could achieve that suburban lifestyle even if they were being shut out of the actual suburbs themselves. So places like LeeHarvard become an especially important place to realize that dream. So what's happening in Cleveland is several things. One would be African-American owned construction firms building new housing for families. This was limited but an important means of expanding housing options. These African-American owned construction firms typically were smaller. They had less access to credit because of discrimination. They were limited to building on land that was considered quote-unquote acceptable for African-American families to build on. And they experienced opposition from nearby white residents as well as from the white-dominated building trades unions. Harrison Adams Company, for example, had 4 homes vandalized in a single coordinated attack in 1954, including one property on the west side in that West Park enclave that I mentioned earlier. Some of these firms struggled. There was one, Southeast Builders, which after a promising start in 1952 went bankrupt less than 4 years later. This was after building almost 100 homes. When it went out of business, it owed customers who were, for the most part, African-American veterans, $50,000, with many of its houses going unfinished. So basically what I'm mentioning by giving you these details is that black-owned construction firms experienced some of the same kind of struggles that black homeowners themselves were experiencing in gaining access to credit and finance, but they still supplied hundreds of homes in this area if you take them all together. And the most successful of all was Albert Taborn's company. Albert Taborn was the first African-American admitted to the Cleveland Home Builders Association in 1953, and he built several hundred homes, mostly in LeeHarvard and in the Mount Pleasant area. He secured FHA and VHA financing, and he often offered loans arranged through the Quincy Savings and Loan Company, which was an African-American owned savings and loan. So basically he was able to tap these existing sources of financing to enable African-American families to buy brand new housing. And this was a big deal because African-Americans oftentimes had to buy secondhand housing. He even invented a design called the Lorenzo, a very popular model that further reduced costs with a hollow brick so that you could run electrical connections very easily. And the Call-in Post quoted one customer satisfied with these Lorenzo homes, which you can see here. She said, "Everything is so completely new. just what we wanted, not something someone else had picked and we got secondhand later. So again, even though these are small numbers of homes, they're very significant in terms of community pride, in terms of employing black building tradesmen. And Arthur Bussey is the focus of the Cleveland Restoration Society's efforts to get historic landmark designation for 2 streets in the LeeHarvard area. He built housing on Myrtle and Highview Avenues and advertised in the Call and Post. You can see these brand new brick bungalows being advertised here at $17,500. These were on the pricier end of the housing market this time. And so in 1959, we had Myrtle Avenue be completed here. You can see that the sewers have been newly installed. In fact, Bussey himself put up the money to finance the sewers for that street. By the late 1950s, white-owned firms were realizing that there was significant money to be made in the African-American housing market. So you started seeing